Hey guys, Jay here. So today we're going to be taking a look at a speaker that I learned about last year during my trip to Expona. And quite frankly, as I've said in that coverage video, the best sounding room for me last year was with these speakers, which is more impressive because Expona is a huge show, one of the largest audio show in the world. This is the Gauder Akustik Capello 100 loudspeakers that I had the privilege to live with for a few months now. It is an incredibly capable loudspeaker, but rightfully so at $25,000 US. Now, if you're someone that's privileged enough to wing a $25,000 loudspeaker, I take donations. Please adopt me. But if not, and you're like the many of us that find a $25,000 price tag on a loudspeaker a little bit tad too extreme, then understand that the reason I review gear and speakers at many different price points, including at this price point, is because of main two reasons. One, I personally find it cool. Whether it be a $25,000 speaker or a $100,000 speaker, I like to review it because it's cool and it's nice to find out, what they're doing differently to justify a price tag like that. The second reason is obviously, well, if I were to find a true gem in hi-fi at reasonable, affordable prices and say something like it punches above this price point, well, if I don't have that reference, I would just be lying and pulling stuff out of my ass. So it keeps me in reference and keeps me relevant to what I'm talking about. However, I understand that some of you don't find these kind of things cool, and sometimes you just watch my channel to see what you can buy, and maybe a $25,000 speaker is not within your budget. Don't worry, I won't be offended if you click off this video. Just understand that I did review many affordable products, more sensibly priced products recently on my channel, so hopefully you check those out. But I do hope that you stick around for this video because the Capello 100s are a pretty darn cool loudspeaker. And again, with a speaker like this, it takes a lot of effort to take it outside, put it up really high so I take accurate measurements. It's a ton of work. So I would really appreciate it if you click that like button on this video to help out. Now, the Capello 100 is a three-way German-made loudspeaker with a cabinet that's drop-shaped like we've seen with few other brands like Sonos Faber. These brands, including Gauder Akustik, claims that a shape like this for the cabinet does help with standing waves and cabinet resonance. But if for anything else, aesthetically, I personally find it more pleasing than a standard box design. Now, the Capello 100s come in different finishes, and I saw the one in the olive veneer finish last year at Expona, and absolutely loved it. But my review pair here is unfortunately piano black. Now personally, I won't be commenting too much on the aesthetic of the speaker because the piano black is such a deal breaker personally for me that I absolutely hate piano black so much that it just is unappealing to me in a big way. But to be fair, this speaker is a very nice looking speaker outside of the piano black that I don't like on this specific finish, and it is a very well braced and well built cabinetry. Like I mentioned, this is a three-way loudspeaker, which means that you get an aluminum dome tweeter and one 7-inch mid-range driver and two 7-inch bass drivers. Now, some of you that are more experts at speaker design may suggest that they should have used a smaller driver for the mid-range driver, and I would have usually agreed. But Gauder Akustik is aware of this problem, and that's why they designed a patented aluminum polymer diaphragm for their drivers that they call X-Pulse. According to Gauder Akustik, this resolves the problem of using a slightly bigger driver for the mid-range by keeping the driver above 3400 Hz for the mid-range. But wait a minute, why would they go through all that trouble instead of just simply using a smaller mid-range driver? Wouldn't that be a simpler solution? Well, presumably the reason for this is because they want to keep the similar tonality, similar characteristics of using the same driver for the mid-range as with the bass driver. And I would usually call this BS, but with my experience with CSS Audio and designing the Typhons in collaboration with them, I've experienced this firsthand that sometimes it's better to use the same driver for the mid-range despite the size. Of course, unless it gets to ridiculously bigger drivers like 10-inch or 12-inch drivers. It is using a genuine WBT binding post that's bi-wireable, and the crossover in this is just absolute insanity. It is a very sophisticated crossover that uses 56 high-quality parts from Germany like Mondorf and Intertechnik. And yes, you heard that right, 56 parts in this crossover. Now, some of that is due to their symmetric crossover design. Now, if you don't know what a symmetric crossover is, it goes beyond the scope of this video to fully explain it, but most speakers use asymmetrical crossover design, while very few, like Gauder Akustik, use symmetrical crossover design. There are, as always, advantages and disadvantages with a design choice like any other, but in case of Gauder Akustik's application here with the Capello 100 loudspeakers, the symmetrical crossover aids and helps the drivers to be within their optimal range of frequency reproduction by having a faster, steeper roll-off so that there's less overlap between the drivers. Which means that it can help with things like phase and better on-axis linear summed response, but also it can help with things like off-axis response as well. The obvious downside to a symmetrical crossover would be the number of parts. But even for a symmetrical crossover, 56 individual parts is a lot of parts. And that also has to do with the fact that Gauder Akustik is one of those companies that is not afraid to throw parts to fix problems in a speaker, as evidently seen by their TDC technology. Now, what is a TDC technology? Well, essentially, when there is a large number of crossover parts, there's a slight electrical time delay for the electrical signal to pass the crossover and get to the drivers. So that small time delay or group delay is basically fixable in the crossover by throwing in, you guessed right, more parts. So what does Gauder Akustik do? Throw in more parts. Basically, the TDC technology by Gauder Akustik is actually nothing too special. It's something that's done by other companies as well. Some companies use basically time delay in the crossover to time align their drivers, while some prefer to do it mechanically. Gauder Akustik strongly believes that the mechanical time alignment of drivers doesn't really work out. So it goes without saying that they do strongly believe that this has to be corrected in the crossover. And Gauder Akustik is actually pretty darn transparent about this and with great explanation on their website. Now, I'm just gonna come out and say it. I'm not a particular fan of using a lot of parts in the crossover. Outside of the purist in me, it just adds to the cost of the speakers tremendously, especially with this many parts. 56 parts for a single speaker is 112 parts for a pair of speakers, and using high quality stuff like Mundorf and Intertechnic parts, that adds to the cost quite significantly. But outside of the speaker adding more cost due to more parts in the crossover, I really can't fault the number of parts in a sonic way. Because sonically, if you didn't tell me that this speaker had this many parts, just by listening to it, I would have never guessed. Sonically, how the speaker sounds and measure is exactly as I expected when I first heard them at Xpona. So let's start with the fun part, the bass. The bass on this speaker, if I were to describe it with one word, it would be thunderous. Not only is the pure extension of the speaker impressive, easily hitting below 20 Hz in room, but just the amount of bass you get out of the speaker is a you amount of bass. And sorry for the language, there is just no other way to put it to describe the amount of bass authority on this loudspeaker. Now, normally with a speaker like this, it would be extremely hard to have them set up optimally in a smaller room. Just because of the sheer amount of bass, it would sound boomy and bloated in the bass region. But this speaker does come with a few adjustments in the bass that can help optimize that bass in your room. Firstly, you have the bass adjustment to adjust the bass plus minus 1.5 dB. This, as you can see from my measurements, affects the entire bass range. The very top blue line is the plus 1.5 dB, followed by the yellow line, that is the 0 dB linear setting, and finally, orange line, that is the negative 1.5 dB setting. On top of the setting, you also get Gauder's unique bass extension modules. Now, this part is a little bit cryptic because depending on how you see it, it's actually attenuating the bass instead of extending it. It just depends on the matter of perspective. So the most bass you will get out of the speaker is with the normal jumper put in there. That's 4 dB in gain in the low bass. You take this jumper out and you get 0 dB of gain in the low bass. This is the least amount of bass you will get with the speaker. In between these two settings are the modules. The white module plus 3.5 dB, green module plus 3 dB, blue module plus 2 dB, and the red module plus 1 dB. Now, if you didn't get all that, that's perfectly fine because with a product like this, it usually means that you will get white glove service from your dealership. meaning that the setup for the bass and the bass modules is really the dealer's job to optimize it in your room, and they're probably trained to do so if they're carrying Gauder Akustik. But if they're not around and you wanted to mess around with it and know what each module is doing, then you can always refer back to this part of the video. In my personal smallish room, I had it at 0 dB setting with negative 1.5 dB jumper, which is quite frankly the lowest bass setting possible with this speaker. But even then, I had to pull the speaker out 4.5 feet from the wall behind it to tame that bass in my room. This speaker is bottom ported to help out with placement, but because it's such a monster in the bass, like I said, I still had to pull him quite far into my room. I am not a particular bass head, but if you are, you will absolutely love the bass on this loudspeaker. And unless you're correcting for your room nodes, the chances are you're not gonna be adding more subwoofers just for more bass. Now, as cliche as it is to talk about hearing new things, new details in your music as an audiophile, I usually get that with mid-range and high frequency on most speakers that I try. But with this speaker, I got it with the bass. From the textures and the nuance with tracks like James Blake, Limit to Your Love, where there are two distinctive notes in the low bass that is often blended together in most speakers, sounded most distinctive than any other speaker I've tried on this speaker. On tracks like Waterfall by Sarah Kay, where there is a thud in the bass that is often not even picked up by majority of the speakers, is not only distinctive on the speaker, but rupturous and can be felt with your body. And that was kind of the ongoing theme while I had the speaker that made me feel like the speaker was on a whole different level. Because even with subwoofers, I didn't hear quite the dynamics and the nuance and the textures that this speaker particularly brings to the table. And not just on dynamic bass tracks, but on vocal tracks as well, which made it just that much more enjoyable to listen through all my tracks. And it was kind of like rediscovering my music that I enjoyed all these years, or hearing the best version of it. As cliche as that sounds, it was true. This was my experience. Now, with most speakers that I've heard in this price range, like Wilson Audio, Focal, Magico, most speakers in this price range does give that bodily sensation in the bass, especially when they're floor standers. Meaning you don't just hear the bass, but you feel the bass with your body. And as weird as that sounds, it's true, and it's something that you have to experience to understand. And for me, this just really takes my experience and enjoyment of a loudspeaker that I listen to another level. On the Capello 100s, it's true that the bass that you get is that with that bodily sensation, just as good as those speakers mentioned, like Wilson Audio brand, Focal, Magico, you name it. They all have the similar bodily sensation when it comes to the bass, and this speaker is just as good. But with a clear advantage that I've not heard from the other speaker brands is the fact that this speaker, the Capello 100s, do have that bass texture and that bodily sensation even at low volumes, which is something that I have not experienced at any price point. Now, usually when it comes to bass authority and the bodily sensation, you do have to crank up the volume quite a bit to get there. Now, this is also true for the Gauder Akustik in that it's more dynamic and more bodily sensation given when you crank up the volume. But even at low volumes, this speaker still had that sensation of bodily hits and low bass extension and bass textures that could be easily and readily heard. Now, in terms of that mid-range and high-frequency presentation on this loudspeaker, it is fairly balanced, very balanced, I would say, with very neutral presentation in the mid-range to high frequency, with just a hair touch of softness when it comes to the high frequency. But just a hair, which not only makes higher pitched notes from instruments like cymbals, trumpet, violin, and female vocals sound so very sweet, with just the right touch of balance of edge to the notes, but this character on this loudspeaker makes it so much easier to listen for long periods of time without any type of ear fatigue. Now, don't get me wrong, this speaker is made to wow you with every detail and nuance in the music, making sure that no particular instrument or parts of the music is louder or softer than the other parts. It is basically plus minus 2 dB across this entire range, which is incredibly reference level which is really not surprising considering the amount of work done in the crossover. Now the slight 2 dB scoop in the upper mid-range and lower treble is honestly not even perceivable to my ears, especially because once you put the speaker into the room, it's going to start sloping down across this range like most speakers and make this response even more linear than you see on this quasi-anechoic response, which is a measurement showing just the speaker's response without the room put into equation. And this is also why I said the high frequency is just a tad little bit softer than what I would consider from perfectly neutral. The soundstage on this speaker is expensive, but not to a degree of unrealistic size that I've heard from some horn speakers in the past. Overall, the depth and the soundstage presentation on this loudspeakers is spacious, but it makes it feel like more real, like what I would experience in a real life setting if I was actually there for the concert. And actually, what sells that illusion of creating this realistic soundstage like I would experience in real life is the layering that comes from the speaker. And when it comes to layering, I mean that the speaker doesn't simply throw a soundstage in front of you, a wall of sound, but it creates a three-dimensional, 3D layered sound to where I can depict instruments and singers to see where they are positioned relative to my listening position. So for example, if the lead guitar is behind the singer by a few centimeters, I can readily hear that instead of having to guess or listen very carefully with some speakers to understand that fact. I also found the imaging of this loudspeaker to be a good balance between sharpness to retain that distinctiveness and separation between instruments, and also the warm and easygoing kind of nature, the softness around the instruments that makes things sound more natural. Overall, if I would have to put it into words, again, I would say that it is as close as possible to what I would experience in real life. And this experience really added to that tonal character and balance that I really loved about this loudspeaker, which made it sound more natural and realistic, where I didn't really have to think about if I'm listening to a speaker, and sometimes I would really forget that it's a speaker. It just makes good music. And also, I was quite impressed by the fact that despite that it didn't have the sharpest imaging that I ever heard on a loudspeaker, it still had really amazing separation capabilities opposed to many other speakers I've heard at this price point even. And this was especially true and more impressive with busy tracks. However, I am talking about reasonably well recorded busy tracks. I'm not talking about, not very well recorded busy tracks with poor panning techniques, because I don't think there's a single speaker in the world that can actually say that. Now, we did talk briefly about setting up the speaker, and the bass management is probably going to be done by a dealer anyways, but we did go through the different bass settings and the, pulling the speaker out into the room to help with that bass management. But you might want to know more on how much toe-in you want on this loudspeaker for that optimal playback. This speaker's horizontal off-axis measurement is fantastic and keeps its original tone throughout the range. Meaning, if you want a little less treble or high frequency, then simply toe the speakers more out towards your room, away from your ears. And if you want more treble, then simply toe them towards your ears more. Another obvious benefit when it comes to a speaker with great horizontal off-axis response would be that the sweet spot will be larger, meaning that you don't have to sit dead center in the middle in the sweet spot all the time, and you can walk around and get the similar type of sound quality. Also, if you have more people than just yourself listening to the speakers in a couch, then you don't have to worry about them not getting the optimal experience either, because they will get similar sound quality as well, thanks to the great off-axis horizontal response. Now, as for seating height, ideally you want to sit on axis with the tweeter, meaning the tweeter should be as high as your ears when you're sitting down on your chair. But everyone has different sofas and lounge chairs, so you may very much be sitting below the tweeter level. So I measured if this would be a problem. And according to this vertical off-axis measurement that I took, it's not a huge problem, and it turns out it's not a big issue. Although again, I would always recommend sitting on axis for the best performance possible. What you don't want to do, as with most speaker, is sit above the tweeter level, which most people won't unless you are in one of those home theaters with rising rows of seats. This speaker is 91 dB in sensitivity, which may have you thinking, well, I can drive this speaker with fairly low powered amplifiers then. not exactly. I've tried many different amplifiers with this speaker as much as I can, and I found that only a handful of them sounded good, while others sounded muted and congested even if they could get loud enough. Most amplifiers sounded like they were holding on to their dear life driving the speaker. Turns out, this speaker not only scales with more capable quality amplifiers, but requires one because this speaker dips below 3 ohms. Now the impedance does change slightly with different bass settings we talked about earlier, but it's not drastic. It still dips below 3 ohms regardless. Which means that this speaker will definitely benefit from quality amplifiers that can handle those low impedance loads, especially on those bass torture tracks. I obviously first tried my AGD Audion monoblocks, which are my reference GunFed Class D amplifiers that should have no problem driving these speakers, and it sounded fantastic with what I thought to be endgame territory even for me. However, this speaker was taken to a whole another level with the Accuphase preamp and amplifier combination that Peter from Motet was so kind to lend me. I heard that Accuphase and Gauder Akustik is a good combination synergistically from many different individuals, so I had to try it out. And my God, thank God I did, because everything that I loved about the Capello 100s were taken to a whole different level with this Accuphase pairing. And again, this speaker not only scales with high quality amplifiers, but almost requires one where it can handle those low impedance loads. So it has its requirements and it needs to be met. So if you're looking at this speaker, be prepared to do your research on the amplifier that you're going to be using. Because this is one of those rare scenarios where if you do not do your research on the amplifier, there can be serious consequences. Quite literally, because despite the rave reviews around this really inexpensive Fosse V3 monoblocks, simply could not drive the speaker, basically clipping and shutting down, and just overall, it sounded like it was dying. So who is this speaker exactly for, other than the fact that you have to be able to buy a $25,000 speaker in the first place? Well, I think for people that's shopping around this price point, they should definitely take a look and audition the Gauder Akustik Capello 100s. But if you've been shopping around this price point, then you may have already auditioned some other competitor brands like Wilson Audio, Focal, Magico, and so on. So here's a little generic comparison of where this speaker fits in compared to those brands. This speaker is more like Sonos Faber speakers in how it delivers a softer, easy to digest high frequency and mid-range, while the bass is more like a marriage between Wilson Audio's authoritative, muscular, clean bass and Sonos Faber's more bloomy and textured bass. I would personally say it's somewhere in between, best of both worlds, however you want to put it. However, if you're someone that really likes a more brighter, more lit up presentation, this is a little bit far from the Focal and Magico kind of more lit up, lively presentation. Although the Capello 100s do have detail and nuance that rivals the Focal and Magico presentation, it definitely sounds more fuller and richer, and so therefore it doesn't feel as lit up and bright. It has a more balanced kind of sound signature. It is just as crazy and perfected in its response as the Orendo 1528 Towers, but with an even more crazy amount of bass and dynamics. I would say the high frequency on the Capello 100s are more refined and more forgiving than the 1528 Towers, and more comparable to that of the Orendo 1528 bookshelf speakers high frequency. And yes, I've said this numerous times, the 1528 bookshelf speaker has a more forgiving and easygoing high frequency presentation than the 1528 tower speakers. But to be completely honest, none of these speakers are as similar to the Capello 100s as to the Rosso Fiorentino Sotaldo loudspeakers I reviewed a while back, which was a speaker with details and nuance and layering out of this world despite its non-fatiguing, easygoing, warm sound. If you ever heard that speaker and imagined that speaker on steroids, especially in that dynamics and with a little bit more open, airy presentation, that's a pretty accurate representation of what this speaker sounds like. So that's it from me. I hope this video was helpful and entertaining. And if it was, please consider clicking that like button and subscribe for more videos just like this in the future. And make sure to check out our merch page on the link description below for our merch. Very high quality. And don't just take it from me, take it from the customers' feedback that we get. Very good quality stuff. I don't like to do anything that's not quality. So please do check it out. So that's pretty much it from me. And I'll see you guys on my next video. Until next time.